In this demo, I want to go ahead and take a look at JavaScript's inline event handlers. And the reality is we're moving away from inline event handlers. But the other reality is that I want to acknowledge that they exist, and I want to make sure that we understand what's going on with inline event handlers. So to start with, I'm going to start with an HTML template, and I'm going to title this Inline Event Handlers. And I'm going to want an external JavaScript file. So I'm going to title it inline.js. And I want to start with an HTML button that is clickable. And when it does get clicked, it triggers an event, and we'll call the event print message. So I'm going to start with an HTML button, type equal to button. And here's where we're going to set up our inline event handler. We're going to say on click, always lowercase. We're going to say on click, go ahead and print a message. And we'll have some text inside the button to print a message. Okay, so we'll go ahead and save this on the desktop. Inline Events will be the folder name, and then I'll stick with the convention of having my HTML file be named index.html. Okay, so I want to give myself a little more screen real estate. There we go. And the way I want to handle this is I'm going to change the editor so that I have some toggled soft wrap, so you can see that the button's wrapping even though I don't actually have a carriage return there in my HTML. So that's what I triggered, so you can kind of see all of the HTML. So the way I want to handle this is I'm going to have this external JavaScript file, and my button, when I click on it, is going to trigger a function called print message. So I'm going to go ahead and create a new file that's going to be inline.js. It's going to have a function definition called print message. And that print message, all we're going to do is log to the console, hello world. Okay, so I should be able to open this up in my browser. So here's my browser window. I'm going to inspect this. And in my console, we should see our message, hello world, and we'll see it get repeated. So 1, 2, 3, 4. So every time I click that button, that function definition is going to get executed. Okay, so this is one example of an inline event handler. Another inline event handler that we might see is a select tag where we do an on change, or on blur when we tab out of a text box. So let's go ahead and add those just so we can see them. So I'm going to start with a select tag, and we'll have a couple of options. Okay, so Wisconsin and Illinois and Minnesota and Michigan. And I probably should have some values in here. I probably should have this alphabetized, but I'm just kind of randomly generating options here at this point. And what I want to do is I want to do an on-change event. Okay, so on-change, all I'm going to do is have a function called value changed. Okay, and we're not even really worried about what these values are or anything like that. All we're worried about is just triggering this event. Okay, so I'm going to have a function called value changed. Okay, so now I should have a drop-down list, and as I change that, you'll see that the value's changed. If I don't change it, if I just reselect Michigan, you'll notice it doesn't get triggered again. So this is only on change. Okay, I can print my message, so I can trigger events from my button, I can trigger events from my drop-down list. I can trigger events from text boxes. So if I start with an input, type equal to text, and then I want to do an on blur, left field, and left field for baseball players is a strange reference, but the idea is that I have a series of text boxes. Okay, so I have a series of text boxes, and as I tab out of them, or as I cursor out of them, so I put my cursor in the next text box, this left field event would then get triggered. So I'm going to go ahead and have another function called left field, and the message here that I'm going to print is user has left the field. Okay, so now I have 3 text boxes. So I start in the first one, I tab, and then I tab again, and then I tab again. And you'll notice what's happening is as soon as I actually cursor out of that field, so I can do that either with a tab or with a mouse click event. So as I leave those fields, I'm triggering that event handler. And what that does is it allows me to maybe validate as the user's filling out a form. I can trigger an on-blur event. Okay, and that's great. And we'll see a ton of this. And at the beginning of this video, I mentioned that inline event handlers are kind of a thing of the past. We're moving away from inline event handlers. And the reason for that is really what's happening here is we are executing JavaScript code inside of our HTML. And the idea of JavaScript is that we want to keep our HTML separate from our JavaScript. It's an important concept because as you get to bigger and bigger applications, the people that are creating the HTML, so maybe graphic designers or some other IT person, it may not be you. And if you're anything like me, my HTML does not necessarily end up looking the way I want it to look. I'd much prefer a designer come through and clean up my HTML and make it look nice and all of those things. That's not my skill set. So the person that's going to ultimately be writing the HTML might be different than the person that's actually writing the JavaScript. And in my case, that's the ideal situation. In order for that to happen seamlessly, I want to make sure that I'm not including JavaScript and HTML in the same files. And the reason for that is my graphic designer might not know JavaScript. And the examples that I gave here are pretty straightforward. On click, on change, they trigger one event handler and it's not a big deal. But these things can get pretty complicated. And we don't want complicated JavaScript inside of our HTML. We want our HTML to be strictly HTML. We want our JavaScript to be strictly JavaScript. So inline event handlers don't reflect that idea of having our HTML and JavaScript separated. Okay. One last thing I want to cover with inline event handlers, besides the fact that, okay, this has been around for a long time, we can use this, it works. This is probably the type of event handling that you have seen in the past, if you've seen event handling in the past. And now I'm saying we want to transition away from it. So let's say that we have 3 text boxes, and I want to go ahead and put them in containers, right? So I'm going to have a div around each of these text boxes. So just a container so that we are on separate lines. And then maybe a label associated with each text box. So for instance, the first one might be for our email. So a label. I'm not even going to handle the for. Another label. This one can be for the name. I'm just doing a little bit of formatting, not much. And then the last one, let's do a label for the course. Okay, so we have 3 separate fields. This is what our user interface is going to look like now, so not very nice, but you get the idea. We have 3 groups of text boxes. And what happens is I want to validate that the user entered something in any of these 3 text boxes. And the way I'm going to do that is on this left field. I only want to write one method. I don't want to have a method for validating the email that something was entered. I don't want to have another method for the name saying it was entered, and then the course. Like that doesn't make a ton of sense. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a function that verifies that there's something entered in that field. So required field. And what you're going to do is you're going to pass in a text box. So this function takes one parameter, which is a text box. I'm going to say if the text box dot value is greater than 0, return true. Otherwise, return false. Okay, so this is our required field. We pass in a text box, so we could be passing in the email text box, the name text box, or the course text box, and we want to validate that the value has some length. And I screwed up the validation in the first example, so I had to add the length. I'm just making sure that there's something entered there. Okay, what I want to do is I want to use this function to determine whether they've entered something. Okay, and instead of doing this console.log message, I want to check this required field. So if required field, passing in some text box here, and the text box that I want to pass in is if I'm leaving the email, then I want to pass in the email. If I'm leaving the name, I want to pass in the name. If I'm leaving the course, I want to pass in the course. So whichever field I'm leaving, that's the one that I want to validate that they've entered something. Okay, so the way I'm going to do that, and I mentioned that this gets a little bit complicated. I was trying to save my JavaScript. If I go back over to my HTML, I have to pass on the control. So I can pass the text box using the this keyword. So on blur, I'm leaving a field, and the field that I'm leaving is this input field. And then same thing here, and same thing here. If I'm not a programmer, then this doesn't make a ton of sense to me. And again, chances are I'm handing off this HTML file to someone else. Okay, so I want to be careful about including this much JavaScript, and this is a reason why we're moving away from this convention, but I want to show you kind of how this would be done. So I'm leaving the field, I'm leaving this field, this input field, the one for the email. I'm leaving this field, the one for the name. I'm leaving this field, the one for the course. So I now, when I leave the field, I'm getting a control. I'm getting a field, either the name, the email, or the course. I can then pass that along to the required field. It checks the value, and then I can do my console.log field.value. Otherwise, they didn't enter anything. Nothing was entered. Okay, so if I run this now, what ends up happening is I leave the email field without entering anything. You'll see I get nothing was entered. If I enter the name field, you'll see it logs Brian, and then the course is Ajax. If I leave the field with nothing there, you'll see I get a validation message saying nothing was entered. Okay, so the last thing I want to do in this video is I want to clean this up. I can make this quite a bit more concise. So the idea here is that the less code I write, the less mistakes I can make. Okay, so instead of this if then else, I'm just returning true or false. What I want to do is I want to return textbox.value.length question mark. This is the ternary operator. And what this does is it says I have to give it two options. If this is true, if this conditional is true, then I'm deciding what should happen if this is true. So I'm going to return just this value. Okay, and I was going to use the ternary operator to say, you know, if that's true, then return true, and if it's false, return false, but that's really redundant. I just want to return this answer. Okay. Same thing here. I could do, let's use the ternary operator here. So I'm going to say let message equal an empty string. And then I want to use the ternary operator. So required field is either going to return true or false. So in the true part, I'm going to say that the message is equal to field.value. And then in the false part, I'm going to say that the message is equal to well, let's do this a little bit different. What I want to do is I want to say message is equal to field, required field, passing in the field, and then I'm going to use the ternary operator here. And if required field returns true, then we'll get our message field.value. Otherwise, we'll get nothing was entered. And then we'll log the message. Okay, so now if I run this, if I enter abc at gmail, you'll see that I get abc at gmail. If I don't enter anything, you'll see nothing's entered. And then the course, I enter Ajax. So it's working exactly the same. It's just a little bit more concise. And the reality is I'm kind of an old school programmer, and I'm trying to move to more modern JavaScript, meaning I want to eliminate if-then-else statements. I want to eliminate looping statements. And the way I'm going to do that is with the ternary operator, and there's other ways to handle looping statements. So I want to make sure that we're covering that type of stuff in this class. Okay, so really this is a demo on inline event handlers, but I also want to start getting into more modern JavaScript programming. Okay, so inline event handlers exist. JavaScript's been around for 25 years, 30 years, and we're dealing with some of the leftover stuff that was in JavaScript, including inline event handlers, even though we might want to move away from inline event handlers in the future.